So, for this Folklore Podcast Lecture, I am delighted to welcome to our virtual stage Dr Joanna Gilar, or Gilar, or Gilar? Gilar, thank you. A word that I have seen many times and should probably have asked how to pronounce before we started, but hey, there you go, live broadcasting for you and all that. Joanna is a poet and a storyteller who works in the fields of myth and fairy tale and the crossover between those things and ecology, as we shall find out in a moment. She gained her PhD from the University of Chichester in fairy tale studies and shape-shifting and eco-fairy tales, so says her website. She also teaches and facilitates storytelling through Story Commons, and she's the founder of the Storytelling Choir. She has published and lectured on these subjects also. She's co-editor of the World Treasury of Fairy Tales and Folklore, which was published in 2016. And she's lectured in Prague and at the University of Chichester, from where came her PhD, in fairy tales and children's literature, and has performed as a storyteller in many, many places around the UK and further afield, and this evening on your little tiny screens, wherever you are sitting at the moment. Joanna, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. I shall pass the platform over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's just a real pleasure to be here in the space. Yeah, and thank you for that lovely introduction. So yes, my name is Joanna Gilar, and as Mark said, I am a storyteller. I call myself a community storyteller, and when I say community storyteller, I use that word because I'm interested in how stories can build community, but I'm also really interested in how we as storytellers or folklorists or artists or creatives can work with the community of stories, and also how we can work with the wider community of humans and more than humans and stories who are all on this world and planet together. So that's how I introduce myself. So I'm here today to talk about animism and ecology in fairy tales. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my background, how I came to be here, and the work that I do. And then I'm going to talk a bit more theoretically about animism and how we relate to animism in fairy tales. And then I'm going to sort of open space, also weave in a few stories, and then open space for conversation. However, because I like things to be porous and open rather than closed, I am inviting conversation all the way through. So if you have any questions or comments, do feel free to share them in the chat. I'll either sort of respond to them as we go, or I'll wait until the question time at the end. But yeah, comments and questions are really welcome. And I'll also have pauses to see if anybody has any thoughts on what I'm saying, so that it's not just me talking at you all the time. Yeah, let me start with a bit about my background and the work that I do. About 10 years ago, I came back from Prague. As Mark mentioned, I lived there for 10 years, which was wonderful. And I came back about 10 years ago to do a PhD in fairy tales and shapeshifting. So I was particularly interested in how in fairy tales how we use fairy tales to explore the border crossing between human and animal, or human and plant, human and more than human. And I was interested in the way in which this border crossing shifts through time. So, for example, we might think about something like Beauty and the Beast, first written down as a novella in 1740 by Villeneuve, But we might think about that novella as the kind of, maybe even the midpoint in representations of animal brides, animal bridegrooms, which, as I'm sure you all know, is a really common folkloric motif. In Beauty and the Beast, it's clearly a curse to become a beast, and the story's trajectory, the happy ending of the story that the story is reaching for, is when that curse is broken and the beast can regain his human form. And even though the sort of the beastliness has a kind of mystique and excitement, it's very much also associated with terror and misery and punishment. If we look back before that to earlier animal bride and bridegroom stories, or indeed if we look across the world at more indigenous stories, it's to become animal or to become in relationship with animal is very rarely a curse or a punishment. There's a beautiful article by Susan Richardson, who calls herself a kind of becoming animal poet. It's an article called Writing on All Fours and was published in Earthline's journal a while ago. And she did a lot of study on this and on the fact that in many indigenous traditions, becoming animal it's very rarely a curse. It's often a gateway to freedom, or it's just neutral. It's not positive, it's not negative, it's just is. It's just what happens. So that's, that exists in the past and also across the world. And then if we look to the present through that story, if we look at more contemporary tellings, again, we see a kind of shift, a real interest, a desire for a positive attribution to the possibility of becoming animal. There's a beautiful collection by Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow called The Beastly Bride, where I think there's maybe 20 stories in that collection, and in sort of 18 of them, it's a positive experience to become an animal. And as Windling says, it shows that we are in the contemporary world really using our stories to negotiate our desire for the world that we feel we know we are losing urgently, drastically and urgently losing. So I think that the shifting, that shape-shifting trajectory of movement through time and through space is something that feels a really important way that we can use fairy tales to explore. I'm just going to have a look at Mark's question. Do we tend to find the most meaningful animalistic or anthropomorphic stories in Indigenous or First Nation cultures? I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that if we're looking at, we find becoming animal stories in all cultures, but I think we attribute meaning to them differently in different cultures. And I think in Indigenous communities, it's just a part of what is, and definitely in the large majority of Western fairy tales, it has a huge, largely negative significance. So I think it's found all over, but I think the meaning that we attribute to it is different, if that makes sense. So that's an example of some of the things that I was looking at, and some of the ways into exploring the ecological through fairy tales. But I'm also really into, not just the theoretical, but the practical. So the other thing that I loved about my PhD was I got a chance to go into schools and work with kids and use fairy tales as what I call forces and forums, as a space to explore our relationship to the natural world. And one of the things that we wanted to do with kids, and this is a work that I'm still doing and is still ongoing after my PhD, it's still something we do with Story Commons, is to invite kids and adults to have a kind of imaginative dialogue with the fairy tales, where you actually explore relationship to the more than human in the story by paying it attention, and by paying the more than human attention. And I think that we describe fairy tales as often as an anthropomorphic medium, in the sense that in these fairy tales, we think that we project our human voices and capabilities onto animals. And in some senses, we do that. Something like, I don't know, Beatrix Potter, where you have the animals in their jackets and suits. That is something that we do in our children's literature and in our fairy tales. But we also hold space in those fairy tales to see the more than human as communicative, as with agency, in a way that might transcend, I think, anthropomorphism. So what I was doing with kids was to invite them to bring attention and observation and sort of a real sensory perception to the more than human in the stories, to allow us to move, I think, past a sense of anthropomorphism to a deeper kind of conversation with the more than human. So that all sounds quite theoretical. So to give you an example, we were in lots of the schools I went to, we worked with the story of the Frog King. And before we actually talked about the story, or we read the story, and then we kind of did a lot of work looking at metamorphosis, looking at the move from the tadpole to the frog, what that means, looking at the science, I suppose. And then we actually went to ponds, and we spent weeks, lots of sessions, where we got the kids just to sort of sit by the pond and observe and sort of give attention to the natural world and bring in, again, their senses to make it sort of an imagined, embodied experience. So what would it be like if you were swimming there, if you were small, if you had frog limbs, if you could jump? What would it be like to be in relation with the flies, the water, the other beings in the pond? What would it be like to be keeping yourself safe, to be threatened by this, by that? What would it feel like to feel the changes of the weather in that water? I think questions like that are a real invitation to just bring a different kind of human capacity and human imagining to the stories. And so when we did that, we took the kids back and we invited them to rewrite, for example, The Frog King. And it was really interesting. They wrote poems, they wrote stories, and their representation of the more than human, their capacity to do that, really shifted. I had some quotes that I wanted to read you. So where were they? We had a really wonderful 7-year-old poet who described the movement of the frog's limbs as arms stretching to extreme ability, and that shift between human and frog became an experience of a whole new world as far as I can spring. So there were lots of beautiful poems that arose and stories that arose in that space. So that was to give you an example of some of the work that I do. And as well as that with kids, what I'm really interested in is sort of weaving fairy tales together, allowing them to weave together and co-create a sort of play of fairy tales where they can explore the ecological crisis, so that we create a magical world interwoven of fairy tales, and within this magical world, they're experiencing ecological crisis in the same way that, we could talk about in the pond. We also observed, as well as living things, we observed plastic, we observed wrappers, we observed cutlery that had been abandoned in the pond, we observed weird weathers and dried up waters. And I think when you bring a conversation about ecological catastrophe, which terrifies adults, let alone kids, but when you bring it into a forum, A, which is magical, and B, where kids feel safe, and C, where they feel like they have some agency, I think there's a shift that happens, and there's a real invitation for kids to bring in an imaginative conversation about that and around that. And so we then, did, when I was doing my doctorate, we did studies as to whether that kind of imaginative work can have an impact on how much kids are engaging with environmental issues. And obviously it's very difficult to tell, but it did seem as if it kind of gives a permission to engage in a way that isn't only catastrophe, but is a way that's also responsive and inviting. Elizabeth, I can send you a copy of my thesis if you would like. It's only published in separate articles in different places, but I can give you more information about that at the end. Thank you for the question. So that's a bit about the work that I bring into schools in terms of ecology and fairy tales. I'm going to have a question break in a minute, so if anybody has any more thoughts, then do put them in the chat, because this process is kind of ongoing and in constant conversation, so conversation is really welcome. A little bit about what I do at the moment. Mark mentioned the storytelling choir. So one of the things that I'm really interested in with fairy tales is sort of inviting them to be, as I said, in community, but also in complexity. And one of the things that I was completely struck by when I was studying my doctorate is how much we've forgotten of the complexity of our fairy stories. And I will talk about that more in a bit. So in 2018, I founded the Storytelling Choir, which gradually has become a group of poets and artists and storytellers who weave together different variants of stories from diverse cultures from across the globe. Last year we did a Rewilding Cinderella project, where we brought Cinderella stories together from Haiti, from Iran, from Afghanistan, Russia, Bulgaria, England, Scotland, Greece, and we wove them together in a concert, an ecological concert, because then after we invited the storytellers who were bringing stories from their own cultures and the stories themselves to be in kind of relation and conversation with each other, we then invited that woven conversation that we were making to be in conversation with the land. And we took the stories to actually a rewilded golf course, which is just outside Brighton. And we wove the stories together into a concept, but also into a ritual. We brought in some amazing contemporary folk music by the Welsh musician Helwyn Williams, who was part of the choir and composed for us in response to the stories. We had Hannah Battershell, who's an amazing artist, and she made she sawed open tiny hazelnuts and put in magical scrolls so that people could interact with the land in a different way, inviting wonder into the space, so that both adults and kids were opening these tiny hazelnuts as they were listening to the stories and unrolling these magical scrolls. And I think, again, for me, it's about inviting stories to be in community and us to be in community with stories. Parts of it worked, parts of it didn't. In the future, we definitely, I think, need to spend longer with the land. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that, because it was a really interesting and important project. And all of the stories can be found on the Story Commons website, which I will give you the link to at the end. So that's a bit about my work. And yeah, I'm just going to pause there, because it feels like there's kind of a lot of thoughts there, and see if anybody has any comments or questions. And I see there's one that's come up already. Great, thank you. Do you want to ask the question, Mark, or shall I read it?
No, I'm quite happy to do it just for the sake of the recording, so anybody watching back will have a full account of it. I'm just thinking about the ecological side of stories. So there are some storytellers near me. There's a storyteller called Lisa Schneidow, who's written books on river folktales and botanical folktales, for example. And she uses traditional and modern stories as a means of commentary on the climate crisis, for example, because she's an ecologist. It's a very important subject for her, and she uses her storytelling in this way. But I just wonder whether when we look back through history, whether that is a new idea at all, though. So to what extent have ecological stories been used for educational purposes historically rather than in modern times?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And yeah, I know Lisa, and her work is absolutely fantastic. I saw a performance around ash trees and ash dieback. She brought it to Brighton, and it was really amazing and powerful. And I think one of the things that Lisa does so powerfully is, again, that kind of interweaving of the science, or the factual, because her training is, she's an ecologist, with the imagination, the imaginative, which feels really vital now. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be bringing the science and the humanities. We need to be bringing conversations together. But to answer your question, I think that ecological stories do go absolutely throughout history, and you can find there's that wonderful Greek myth. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's where somebody chops down a tree, that it's a sacred tree, and he's struck by this terrible hunger, and he can't stop eating, he can't stop consuming, so he just consumes and he consumes and he consumes until he dies. And I think that seems an incredibly apt representation for today, and that sense of our disrespect for the sacred, or maybe our blindness, or our loss of acknowledgement or understanding that we are embedded in a living network, creating within us this deep, insatiable hunger for material things, but we don't respect the material that we surround ourselves with. We just want more and more and more of it, and as we grab more and more and more of it, we destroy the material. So I think that's a great story, and I think that that absolutely that ecological stories go through history. But I also think that maybe the meaning of ecology has changed, and need for stories has changed. There's a beautiful, I'm a really big fan of David Abram, who, if you don't know him, he's a sort of ecologist and philosopher. And there's a beautiful article by him called Storytelling and Wonder, which you can find online. And there he talks about the fact that stories used to be maps for the way of living in the world. They used to be they used to contain within them instructions and ingredients as to how to function. If you look at sort of the Aboriginal songlines, they used to literally map onto the land. And so I think, rather than finding a huge amount of stories that teach us to be ecological, I think what we find in the past is stories where it's unquestioned that we are absolutely embedded in the world, and that stories have always been ways to imaginatively negotiate our way of living in the world, if that makes sense. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I hope that answers your question. So Elizabeth, can we get Elizabeth to read her question, Mark, or shall I read it?
I'll do it for you if you like. So Elizabeth asks, thinking on the idea of shape-shifting, how do you respond to the notion that fairy tales themselves are shape-shifters, and we've become too preoccupied with a fixed notion of how we must relate to them, thinking in the predominance of the grim tellings?
I think it's, yes, good. I just have to digest this. Thinking on the idea of shapeshifting, how do you respond to the notion that fairy tales and make to a fixed notion of them? Yes, absolutely. And I think that is really what I'm going to go on to next. So it's a great question to lead me on to the next section. Because I think that it also speaks to the division between the written and the oral, and the fact that when the stories were written down, they became fixed in a way that they hadn't been before. And I think that when the stories were oral, they were also in conversation with their contexts, with the land, with their peoples. And when they became written, they were, in a sense, divorced from that context. And one of the things that the context allowed was it also allowed a fluidity and a consistent shifting. And that's not to say that stories don't shift and aren't shifting, but I think that they shift in different ways. And I also think that one of the really important ways of exploring stories and fairy tales today is both to acknowledge the multiplicity of their shape-shifting past, and also to invite ourselves to be participant in their shape-shifting future, if that makes sense. So thanks, Elizabeth. That is a great question. And also thank you, Lisa, for Erysichthon of Thessaly. Thessaly is the Greek character who eventually eats himself. Ben Haggerty tells a great version. Yeah, it's really an amazing myth. Okay, so to move on a bit, I just want to think about the notion of animism, if we're going to talk about animism in fairy tales. So the word animist, originally coined by Sir Edward Taylor in 1871, meaning somebody who believes that objects are animate, as in they have souls. It was originally used to describe what was believed to be a wrong or primitive view. And so to distinguish themselves from that understanding of animism, people who call themselves new animists or a sense of new animism is not so much a focus on whether or not objects have souls, but rather a focus away from the concept of individual or separated objects, and a move to understanding the world not so much via individual beings, but relationships. So new animism is about exploring the world, understanding the world as a relational space. There's some really lovely quotes I'm going to read out. So Graham Harvey talks a lot about animism, and he's recently written with Miguel Astor Aguilera, and they define animism as an understanding in which the world is not composed by and for humans, but it's one in which humans are part of a larger relational community where a multitude of agents, seen and unseen, interact. And again, a lovely quote by Wahinkpe Topa, otherwise known as Four Feathers, and Darsha Naves. There's a beautiful book that they recently published on kinship, which starts every chapter with Indigenous voices on different aspects of kinship, and then Four Feathers and Darsha Naves have a conversation about that. It's really powerful, beautiful book. It's called Restoring the Kinship Worldview, and I really recommend it. So how they classified the view, they don't so much use the term animist, but they describe, they use the word polysemy, which is really interesting, as a word to describe a world which is one of dynamic unity. Everything is connected and interacting with no separable or static objects. So that sense that we are in constant relation and we are open and porous and fluid and not closed systems. And in a way, that move away from understanding ourselves as closed systems is where we as where the Western world as physicists, biologists, philosophers, ecologists, we're trying to get to now. We're trying to be able to move ourselves away from that kind of atomistic viewpoint. As the wonderful scholar Tyson Yunkaporta has put it, for the last century, in different ways and forms, we have been struggling to detach ourselves from a modernist viewpoint where we humans, as the apex of the hierarchy, interact with a world of muted and passive things. And yeah, just that sense of I think an invitation to be in a world that's living and alive and agential, which is a great word, meaning everything around us has agency. And I just want to read you some quotes by contemporary ecologists who are, I guess, trying to get their head around this world from a Western viewpoint. And it's really beautiful. So Timothy Morton, who's an ecologist, has written of reality as a mesh, a concatenation of interrelations that blur and confound boundaries at practically any level. And the wonderful philosopher Donna Haraway, we aren't single beings. We are symbiotic, provisional entities with porous and layered and palimpsestic and provisional kind of boundaries. So that was quite a lot of quotes. I'm just going to read Donna Haraway's again. And as I do, just invite you, if it feels comfortable, to imagine yourself as that kind of being. We aren't single beings. We are symbiotic, provisional entities with porous and layered and palimpsestic and provisional kind of boundaries. So what we're viewing or thinking about here is a different way to understand the world. And one of the, I guess, fundamental aspects of that animist way of understanding the world is that we don't just attribute agency to beings around us, more than human beings, plants, animals, stones, river systems, but we also attribute to them a kind of a semiotic capacity. In other words, an ability to communicate with themselves, with the systems, and with each other. And historically, in Western culture, that attribution of semiotic or communicative capability to the more than human has often been confined to the fairy tale or the myth or the wonder story or the folklore. And I think this is the last quote that I wanted to share, but Val Plumwood talks about this, saying that we confine radical openness to the other to fairy stories. So that's what we do in Western culture. Yeah, exactly, Ali, amazing. Donna Haraway is amazing. Yeah, Val Plumwood, also amazing, by the way. If anybody wants to look her up online and read her article about being nearly eaten alive by a crocodile, it's incredible. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that route, but look it up. Val Plumwood talks about the importance of eco-critical ecological writing and how this capability to attribute agency and communication to the more than human has been in the Western world segmented into the fairy tale. She says we confine radical openness to the other, to fairy stories, to what we consider the irrational. And then she says, if anthropomorphism means writing an active, intentional, ecological world and expanding our range of sensitivity to non-human actors and elements, it would be highly rational, especially in the current dire ecological situation, to have more of it. So I really like this, I guess, concept that we have sort of segmented our capability to understand animism into our stories. Because in one way, it means that now, if we want to survive, we must begin to take seriously that attribution, that understanding. And it means that we have projected around us, not communicative ability to everybody else, what we've projected onto the world around us is a deadness, a complete passivity, a sense of non-action and agency, whereas that's probably completely untrue. But it also means that our stories are teeming with potential and with possibility, and with the permission that often the Western world hasn't allowed us to imagine a world with which we are interactive. And so I want to think more about how we respectfully, while comprehending their layered complexity, also use fairy tales to invite us into an animist perspective and viewpoint. And there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions, but might go straight on. Yes, thank you for sharing the amazing article. Okay, great. Fantastic. So why then do fairy tales matter? I think you get that sense of an animist understanding in myth, in folklore, all through our traditional stories. I'm particularly interested in fairy tales because fairy tales to me feel both complex and common. So they feel common because everybody, I think, feels welcome into the world of the fairy tale. You and all ages feel welcome. You know, you tell fairy tales nowadays to kids, everybody knows them, and it feels like a space in which people are invited. But then also important is to understand the complexity of the fairy tales. And as I said with Rewilding Cinderella, it's also paradoxical because while it feels like fairy tales are common, everybody is invited into their space, we have drastically forgotten the multiple complexity of the fairy tales, particularly in a sense of whitewashing these stories. So when we imagine Cinderella, we imagine her as a white, blonde, blue-eyed heroine who is largely passive and, you know, has to find her shoe. Whereas this is a story which has existed all over the world, probably originated in 9th century China. I should say story cycle rather than story, and has variants across the world. And actually, when we work with fairy tales today, really crucial is to understand their geographical and located complexity. But also, I think what's important is to understand the complexity of the value systems that accrue to our fairy tales. So it's easy for me to say fairy tales are animist. Great, we can use them to direct us to an animist and magical world. But that's only, of course, one layer of value system that the fairy tale carries. Because the other thing that is so wonderful and exciting about the fairy tale is how often it's retold. And that means that every time it's told, it takes on another layer of meaning, of comprehension, of ideas and a voice. As Jack Zipes, the fairy tale scholar, has said, fairy tales are not one ideal, beautiful thing. They are multi-layered, palimpsestic, internalized, potent, and explosive. And they contain the value systems of every peoples who told them. So while we can see layers of a kind of what we might now consider to be an indigenous animist understanding of the world, we can also see layers of modernism, of rationalism. And maybe all these layers are really important with the Grimms. Somebody mentioned the Grimms. We can see a kind of more Protestant work ethic, what we would now consider, you know, gender stereotyping. But then today we get more feminist layers, we get ecological layers. So I think that understanding of the layering of complex value systems into our fairy tales are really important. And if we're going to work with them ecologically, we also have to work with their complexity, both geographically, both culturally, multiculturally, and in terms of the value systems that they hold, if that makes any sense. I wanted to mention briefly an example of that layered complexity as related to an animist understanding. And that example is the grateful animal type tale, which again you find all over the world. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. And in the grateful animal stories, you find that the hero or the heroine does something to rescue an animal, and then they are then saved by the animal and allowed to continue with their quest. And there's a great example. I'm not going to tell the whole story now because we don't have time, but there's a great example in Czech called Zlata Vlaska, which is the princess with the golden hair. Translates as Goldilocks, but it's a different Goldilocks. And in this story, it starts with a king who knows everything, and then an old woman offers him a snake in a basket, and the snake's going to allow him to understand the language of the birds and the beasts. And of course, he doesn't prepare the snake for himself. He asks his cook to prepare the snake. And as we all know, if we're familiar with the story of Taliesin and Ceridwen, as the cook is preparing the snake, drop of fat jumps onto his thumb, and he puts his thumb in his mouth, and then of course he can understand the language of all the birds and the beasts. The king is furious, sends him out, almost executes him, but decides instead to send him out to search for the bride for him, Zlatovlaska of the golden hair. He says to Yizi, if you don't find her and bring her back, then I will kill you. So Yizi goes out, and as he's going on his quest, he encounters all of these animals. He encounters ants whose anthill is burning, and they're calling for his help. So he stamps out the fire in the anthill. He rescues baby ravens who've fallen from their nests. He rescues a golden fish that two fishermen are fighting over, and hears the pain and the agony of that fish and sends it back into the waters, and then hears the voice of that gratitude as the fish sinks into the deep and green and flowing waters. And of course, when Yizi gets to the palace, he's given all these tests. He has to find pearls in a field, and of course the ants turn out to help him to find the pearls. He has to find a golden ring in the ocean, and the fish finds the ring for him. And he has to find the waters of life and death, and of course it's the baby ravens who find the waters of life and death. And as happens so often in this particular tale type, Zlatovlaska and Yizi fall in love. And when they go home, when he's permitted to take Zlatovlaska and they get back to the king sees Yizi and decides that he's going to kill him after all, so he slices his head off. But Zlatovlaska asks for his body, his head and his body, as a wedding present. And when she has his head and his body, she sprinkles the waters of death onto him, and the head and the body jump back together. And then she sprinkles the waters of life, and he comes back to life, young and rejuvenated and glowing like the sun. The king wants exactly the same thing to happen to him. It's his wedding day after all. He doesn't want to be outshone by his cook. So he commands the executioner to cut off his head, and for Zlatovlaska to do exactly the same thing. The king loses his head. Zlatovlaska sprinkles the king with the waters of life, and then says, oh, I did it the wrong way around. I should have started with the waters of death. But there aren't any waters of death. Well, I've used up the waters of life now, so sorry, I can't bring him back. And so the king can't come back, and Zlatovlaska doesn't have anyone to marry, and Yizi proposes, and the two of them marry and end up ruling the kingdom. A very short summary of the wonderful fairy story. I hope it didn't feel too condensed. You can find it online. It's originally by Ebba Urban, but it's also made into a wonderful Czech musical. But one of the things that is interesting about this story is that you can see how you have traces of an interconnected, agential and semiotic communicative world. And you can see how that sense of the fact that to succeed in anything or to exist in any kind of significant way, it's absolutely fundamental not to go straight from A to B, but to wander and to listen to the beings on the pathway and to help them and to acknowledge that you are utterly embedded in this network, and what you do will then come back to you, but you're absolutely part of that network. And that feels like a really crucially animist and ecological viewpoint. But also in that story, we can, thanks Mark for the link, also in that story we can see, or we can feel, I think, different layers. So we can see that sense of anthropocentrism. The animals are there just to help Yizi. They don't have roles in themselves. They're there as props in a way to move him on his journey. And his journey is, I suppose, a hero's journey. He goes from A to B. It ends with a heterosexual happy ending, ties off with this nice marriage, which most of our Western fairy tales do. And yeah, the animals are there just to help him along. They don't have their own roles, really, their own parts. So I think I just wanted to bring that story into the space because you can kind of feel the tension. Even when I'm telling it, I can feel the tension of wanting to, I guess, luxuriate in the permission to believe in this animist world in which you can save an ant and then the ant will save you, but also of acknowledging that the problematic aspects of that and the anthropocentric aspects of that. So you just wanted to allow that, that tension to bear in space. I think there are many other examples of fairy tales which, when we look at their complexity, we can see, I guess, the importance of the animist perspective, the ecological perspective, but also all the layers that they carry, and sort of invite ourselves to be participant in those layers. Again, I think talking about coming back to Cinderella, because, or as the Rewilding Cinderella team started to call the story cycle, we started to call it the Ash Child cycle. And we assume that this is a story about a marriage, and it's a story about an obedient and passive heroine being rewarded for her goodness with transformative beauty and rescued by a prince. But actually, if you look at the history of the stories, they're very, very different and very, very teeming with, I guess, ecological complexity, with questions about how we mediate between human and animal and life and death. The story, as I think I mentioned earlier, was first written down, or one of these stories was first written down in southern China in the 9th century. And as you may know, that's the story of Ye Shen, who is a girl who loses her mother and is brought up by her father's second wife, and she befriends a golden fish, and the golden fish looks after her, and she shares her food with the fish, and she becomes friends with it. And then her stepmother kills the fish, and she's so struck in the heart with grief that she goes into the fields and she rends her hair and her clothes and she just howls to the sky. And then she has this vision, and this vision comes down to speak to her. It actually in the text it's ungendered. So this vision, they come and they arrive and they say to her, gather the bones from the dung heap and put them in a pot and put them under your bed. So she gathers the bones of the golden fish and she puts the bones in the pot and puts them at the foot of her bed. And then she discovers that the bones are magical and will grant her any wish that she desires. And one of her desires is a beautiful kingfisher blue cloak and golden slippers. And the story unfolds from there. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but you can find it. Maybe Mark, you seem to be on it. You can share the link. If you're interested in that, there's a really wonderful article. I think it's available online by Faye Beauchamp, who really goes into that story and discusses it. But what I wanted to say about that story is that that fact of the magical guardian not being human shaped, not being fairy godmother shaped, but being animal or plant shaped, is what we find in 90% of these Ash Child variants. In Scotland, the mother returns as a sheep, or in Bulgaria she returns as a cow. In Russia it's a sheep. In some versions it's a snake or a pig. In the sort of the German version, it's the mother comes back, or a hazel tree grows on her grave. And there's a sense of what makes the transformation is not how good she is, and it's not the sudden arrival of the fairy godmother to reward her for being passive and obedient. What makes the transformation is how she negotiates with the bones of the animal that is her dead mother, how she prepares the ritual, how she cares for and tends these bones. And then she discovers that the bones often have transformed to the most precious and golden threads. And then she can attend the space and community, the ball or the feast that she has been absent from because she's been weighed down by her grief. So again, we can unwrap that story more, and maybe we can in the questions. But I think that sense of how we negotiate to a world that's fluid, that isn't one thing, where we're not one thing, where maybe we will, after this life, pass on to animal, to plant, how we respect, how we relate to our ancestors. We don't hold these questions in our understanding of Cinderella. I don't know any school class that does that. Sometimes people tell Ye Shen, but it feels really important because these are the questions that we need to be asking today. So yes, as Mark said, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat. And there are other examples that we could talk about. And, you know, if we have time in the questions, we can come back to. There's unwrapping, you know, Little Red Riding Hood, which has layers of incredibly complex historical versions, which are not about being obedient and staying on the path, but they're really about actually allowing yourself to experience the wild and trust that you can find the way home again. And more like Frog King versions, where it's about a negotiation with water guardians. It's not about getting back a toy that's been lost. It's about how you get fresh water, how you negotiate with these amphibian guardians of the deep. Happy to go more into any of these. And I think you may notice that I've talked mainly about fairy tales that are very well known. And I want to acknowledge as I'm doing this that, you know, one of the ways in which we've forgotten fairy tale complexity is that we've forgotten thousands of other stories that don't get into the kind of this top 10 of fairy tales. And these are just as important, and just as the fairy tale collectors who we've forgotten, the fairy tale, you know, the fairy tale speakers, those who told the stories, the folklore and the fairy tale. But the reason that I'm a bit obsessed with these top 10 is because I think that they are common ground. I think that they're stories we've been telling and retelling so much that we think that they're really cliched and boring. And we sort of tell them to our children because we kind of can't find sometimes anything else, and it's on the shelf, or it's on, it's there. But actually, I also think that they are spaces in which we can go into to explore this really, really powerful forgotten complexity that allows us to relate to a kind of living and animist world that is teeming with agency, with communication. And so I've got 5 minutes left, and I think the last question that I wanted to ask is how we tell these stories today, and how we give ourselves permission to maybe wrestle a little bit with this anthropocentrism, with the sense of kind of human supremacy that we can find in the stories, with sexism, of course. How we can wrestle with that, how we can wrestle with our obsession with marriage happy endings, but also respect the complexity of the story, and also respect the geographical and spatial multiplicity of these stories. A story that I've been working with a lot recently is the story of Childe Roland, which is an English folktale that's not very well known, but seems to have somehow seeped into culture in a way that just seems somehow kind of symbolic. So Childe Roland is the story, and then Browning wrote the poem Childe Roland and the Dark Tower came, and then Louis MacNeice wrote a play called The Dark Tower. There you go. It's a story that seems somehow significant. But in the story itself, what happens is that Childe Roland loses his sister, Bird Ellen, because she runs the wrong way. She runs widdershins round the church tower when the sun is setting, and she's taken by the fairy king. And in the story, he goes to Merlin. All 3 brothers go to Merlin, and Merlin tells them that in order to rescue Bird Ellen, they have to take the head off the first 3 beings that they meet in Fairyland, and then they can enter Fairyland and rescue Bird Ellen. Two older brothers fail, and Roland succeeds. He beheads the first three beings that he meets in fairyland. He fights the fairy king, and he brings his sister home. As I was working with this story today, I wanted to ask, is there a way to tell this differently? Is there a way to allow a kind of shift? Because the symbology of beheading in this story, in the Frog King story, also has sort of symbolic complexity and lots of different layers. So it feels, even though for me it feels an uncomfortable way to approach the other world, it feels a difficult message to be carrying in the story: behead what you don't trust, a sense of human superiority, a sense of humans interacting in a way that's about defeating rather than engaging with. So I worked with the story on the land, and I worked with the story walking it, because I always, as the amazing storyteller Shona Lee Cumbers says, always walk with stories, always bring them outside into the land, and then you can allow that conversation. And so I worked with the story, and I walked with the story on the Sussex landscape, and I allowed a kind of shift in the story. And again, it's a conversation whether that shift is possible, whether that shift feels genuine to the story or not. And I can talk more about that shift if people are interested in the questions. But I think, just to conclude, I feel like we need to have imaginative conversations with our stories, because our stories hold within them this teeming potentiality of acknowledging the animist, living, sacred nature of the world that we have deeply forgotten. But when we have these imaginative conversations, they need to be had in a way that it respects the complexity of the stories with which we're working. We need to invite in rather than eradicate. We need to invite in people to have conversations with, to build communities. We don't need to be sort of individual tellers. We need to be part of deeper and wider communities, and we need to allow our stories to be part of deeper and wider communities of the human and more than human world. It is 20:59. I'm up for questions.
Thank you, Joanna. There's a couple of points that have just come in the chat here, which are all about Red Riding Hood things. That's where we've gone now. So Elizabeth James says, I think Red Riding Hood is a great example of the gendered way we interact, translate and give meaning to fairy tales, thinking of Jack Zipes' interpretation of red versus women's rites of passage, interaction with it. Any comments on that one?
Yeah, and just to add Lisa's comment that Nell Phoenix's show Little Red Riding Hood and Other Lost Girls explores different versions of that story brilliantly. Yeah, Mark, do you want to add your comment, and then I'll comment on all three of them?
My last one was just a link to many years ago now. I made a short film called The Red Hooded Girl. I didn't write it, I just made the film, which takes the Red Riding Hood story as its basis, but has a bit more lycanthropy in it than the original. So there's a link there if anyone wants to watch it.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's respond to Little Red Riding Hood. I think that Elizabeth is absolutely right, and I think Little Red is a great example. And for those of you who don't know the older oral versions of the story, I'll just kind of respond to it very briefly, in that when Charles Perrault wrote down Little Red Riding Hood, he wrote it down, I think it's 1697, with the moral at the end: attractive, well-bred young ladies should never talk to strangers, or they might provide dinner for a wolf. And this, we don't know whether he was being sarcastic or ironic and taking a jab at the hypocrisy of the French court or not. But this idea that this is a story about being safe, being modest, being careful, being sort of, being protecting your modesty as a woman is, and being obedient, is something that has been a value system that has been sort of fed into this story as it was written down by Charles Perrault and the Grimms. But in sort of the early part of the 20th century, some scholars found a version, the grandmother, which is found in variants the world over. And this version they found was in the Loire Valley in France. And it's really fascinating because what happens is you have a girl, she goes to see her grandmother and she meets a werewolf. The werewolf asks her if she's taken the path of needles or the path of pins. She says that she's taking the path of pins. The werewolf says he'll take the path of needles and he'll get there first. The wolf gets there, the werewolf eats the grandmother and takes a little bit of the grandmother's blood and puts it on the table, and takes some of the grandmother's flesh and puts it on the table. And so when the girl arrives, the werewolf, who's in the bed, dressed in the grandmother's clothes, invites her to eat and drink the wine and the meat that's on the table. So she ends up consuming parts of her grandmother. And then the werewolf invites her to take off her clothes, throw them in the fire, and come into bed. So she does take off her clothes, she throws them in the fire. Yes, exactly, Mark. She takes off her clothes, she throws them in the fire, and she comes towards the werewolf. But as she's doing so, she feels that she is unsafe. And so she asks the questions that we know so well. She asks, what big arms you have, all the better to hug you with. How hairy you are, all the better to keep you warm. And then she says, what big teeth you have. And he says, all the better to eat you with. And so she knows at that moment that she is facing her death. And what she does is she says to the wolf, I need to take a piss. I need to take a piss. And the wolf, completely taken aback, says, well, do it in bed. And she says, no, I need to go outside. And so he ties a ribbon around her ankle. She goes outside, she gets to a birch tree, she unties the ribbon and ties it around the birch tree and runs for her life. She gets to a river where there are 4 laundry women washing clothes. She asks the laundry women to help her. And they take a sheet, they stretch it across the river, holding the 4 corners, and she walks across that sheet like a bridge and comes straight safe home. The werewolf, discovering what has happened, pursues his prey, and he comes to the laundry women on the river and says, help me, for my prey has fled from me. And so they take the sheet, they hold the 4 corners of the sheet, and as soon as he is in the center of that sheet, they let the corners go, and he sinks down to his death. And the girl gets safely home, and that's the story. And I think there are lots of variants of that all over the world, but there's so much interesting complexity here. As Elizabeth pointed out, it's really interesting from a gendered perspective. She doesn't need a huntsman to rescue her. She doesn't need anybody to slice the wolf open. She needs her own wits, her body, she brings her body into the space. I need to take a piss. She uses her wits, she uses her guile, she uses her body, and she gets out of that. And then what she finds when she gets out of there is the guardians of the past. She finds the laundry women, these guardians of rites of passage, and they guide her and guard her to move the way across. And there's a really interesting article by Terry Windling about the grandmother, exploring the symbology of needles and pins and of the laundry women. And in this article, she, in the same way that Jack Zipes has suggested, argue that this story is trace evidence of an old initiation or rite of passage ritual. As Mark says, it's got a very Eucharist energy to consume your grandmother. What does it mean? It feels like it has this ancient ritualistic, strange energy about it. But the laundry women feel like these guardians of the path, because they're the laundry women. They would prepare the swaddling clothes of the baby, the bridal gown, and the funeral clothes. So they're the people who hold these rites of passage. So again, I think what you have in the grandmother is a story that's not a closed system. It's not, it's an open system, which may long ago have been an actual way of interacting with the living world and a way of inviting ourselves to encounter the wild and learn how to come home safely, as well as a way of teaching us that there are dangers in the world and that we need to find a way of protecting us, as well as a way of inviting us into our own adulthood. So it's a very, very complex story, and I recommend reading Terry Weinling's article about it, as well as Jack Zipes, what he writes on it in his book. I think it was his first book, The Art of Subversion, and he has a very interesting chapter on that story. Just going to look at these comments. Yeah. They could be the fates, yeah, absolutely, or the 4 directions in pagan ceremony. And Lisa says, and the Celtic washerwoman at the ford, absolutely. That sense of the flowing river, and the 4 people holding the corners of the flowing river feels really important, and we can attribute to them all sorts of meanings, but they're there in the story and they're doing what they need to do. Okay, does anybody have any more questions or comments or thoughts?
Yes, just before we wrap up, if anybody else has got anything they want to ask Joanna before I ask her to give us all the places that you can go and look at other examples of her work and things that she would like to promote, then do please pop them questions or comments in the chat at this stage. There's a lot of food for thought, I think, in what we've heard tonight. There we go, Julia. Where do you think Angela Carter fits with the themes discussed today?
Yes, great question. I think Angela Carter fits really crucially in the themes that we've discussed today, because she is a great example of that sense of being participant in the living, shifting nature of the stories. I think that she sort of acknowledges that the fairy tales were not originally for children, that they have themes that are violent and sexual and bloody and difficult and strange, and her writing, allows these to come through in a way that is so rich and complex. Her writing allowed, because it's so beautiful, it allows space for that complexity. And I think, she's inspired so many fairy tale lovers, and she's also given us permission, I think, with The Bloody Chamber and with her novels, to take fairy tales seriously or to relate to them in an adult way, because it's true that fairy tales were not always for children, they were for community. And also I think Carter, there's something about the way that she acknowledges the complexity of sexuality, acknowledges the complexity of desire in a way that really finds its form and its force within these multiple complex stories. So yeah, really fundamentally, I would say.
Okay, and the final one there isn't a question, but it is just Elizabeth Jane saying, just to say thank you for such a rich talk and conversation, which indeed we have had this evening. When I left Bath, I left a red apple on the doorstep of Angela Carter's house. They're brilliant.
Wonderful.
Okay, unless anybody else has got anything they would like to ask, in which case do pop it in there whilst I'm talking. I think we're probably coming towards the end of what people have wanted to ask by the looks of it. So if you don't have anything else that you would like to ask Joanna, then do join Elizabeth Jane and myself in saying thank you in whichever way you choose to do so for this excellent and thought-provoking presentation. Joanna, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you for your wonderful questions. Yeah, it was a real honor to discuss fairy tales with you all tonight.
Thank you. So before I stop recording, for the benefit of those that are watching this back later on, do please now tell people where they can go on the internet or anywhere else to find more about you and what you do.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so I have a website which is just joannagilar.com. I'm also on Instagram, where I post most of what I'm doing. And then there's also Story Commons, which is now a community interest company. So Story Commons has a website, and so do I. You can subscribe on the Story Commons website to hear more about what we are doing and what I'm doing. I'm also going to be running a couple of workshops and courses. I think this autumn I'm going to run an online storytelling choir called Bodies of Wonder, where we'll explore our sort of, we'll bring stories together to explore our relationship to the wild, embodied world. And I'm also running a workshop on wild rituals, so using stories in rituals to build, particularly for young people, a deeper connection to the landscape. And you can find all of that on my website, which is joannagilar.com. You're muted, Mark.
I am. My screen has just told me that I forgot to unmute myself. Do go to that website, www.joannagilar.com, and you can link through to all of those places. Joanna, again, thank you so much for coming and speaking this evening. The next Folklore Podcast Lecture is coming up at the other end of this month, on Saturday, the 23rd of September. When our guest will be Dr. Peter Hewitt. Peter is a past manager of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle in Cornwall. He now works in Dumfries and Galloway area museums, but he is also the founder of the Folklore Museums Network. And Peter is going to be discussing that nebulous term, intangible cultural heritage. So Peter is going to be looking at the difficulties and techniques and what people do in order to try and collect and save and preserve those elements of our heritage that are not tangible, that you cannot hold in your hand. We've talked about rituals today, for example. There are many, many other examples of intangible cultural heritage. If you'd like to join us for that, or any of the other podcast lectures which are coming up this year, which very briefly are what looks to be a very entertaining talk from my colleague Dr. Paul Cowdell in October, called Spirits and Spirits, which is all about people who see ghosts whilst under the influence of alcohol. We then have a session on folk narrative for writers. Back to Fairy Tales with Catherine Langrish in November, for the tale of the three weird sisters, lost fairy tales of 16th and 17th century England and Scotland. And then finally, rounding off the year in December, Dr. Maria de Blasi, who will be discussing the magic of Yule witches. If you want to join us for any of those talks, then you can get your tickets from the same places you got them for tonight, at www.thefolklorepodcast.com/lectures. You can also get access to everything that has gone before as well. Thank you all so much for coming and joining us this evening, and I hope we'll see you all again very soon. Thank you.